Are you running out of new canvases, but have an old painting you don't really care for anymore and would be fine painting over? Keep watching. I have this old nesting doll painting that was a fun idea at the time, but the execution wasn't that great, so I'd like to use this canvas board for painting something else. If the old painting was made with acrylics, you can just paint over it with acrylic gesso. This is the same procedure you would do when priming a new unpainted surface like cardboard. If there's thick paint on the canvas, you can try sanding it down first with fine sandpaper. Keep in mind though that it might take away the canvas texture as well. Then you can move the gesso after wiping down any dust from the painting with a damp cloth. Paint over the canvas with acrylic gesso and use a large flat brush or a sponge brush. I'll list and link below all the supplies I used. Paint 2 layers of gesso or more if it's harder to cover up the old painting. I'm painting a vertical layer and a horizontal layer once the first layer has dried a bit. Remember to paint over the sides as well. Since my painting had a black background, it was quite difficult to cover up with white gesso and 2 layers were not enough. I could have tried layering on more gesso, but I decided to paint it black instead. So for the 3rd layer, I mixed black acrylic paint with white gesso to color it black or dark gray. I didn't use the black on its own, since all of the black acrylic paints I have are kind of transparent, so I wanted to mix it with something opaque like white gesso. Then just let it dry and your canvas is ready to be reused. You can paint over it with acrylic or oils. A couple of questions that might come up are, what if the old painting was an oil painting and not an acrylic painting? You can paint over acrylics with oils, but you should not paint over oils with acrylics. So if you use acrylic gesso over an oil painting, your new painting might actually peel off eventually. You can try painting white or black oil paint over it instead. Well, in that case, can you paint white acrylic paint over an old acrylic painting instead of gesso? I don't see why not, assuming that the canvas was already primed for the old painting. However, depending on the type of white acrylic paint you have, it might take more paint than gesso to cover up the old acrylic painting. Now, if the old painting was already varnished, you would need to know what type of varnish it was to know whether you can paint acrylic paint or gesso over it. I haven't actually decided what to paint on this canvas yet, so you can leave suggestions in the comments. I got this canvas painting for free at my local reuse center. They sell old art and even unused art supplies, but I found this used canvas at the free section. Let's prime it and paint over it. Hello! This painting has some thicker paint layers, especially on the characters' eyes, hands and wings, so I'll sand those down with fine sandpaper. The grit size is 120. You don't have to use this exact one, but the higher the grit size, the finer the sandpaper. And you should wear a mask while sanding, because the paint particles coming off the painting can be harmful. Then I'm wiping the dust off the canvas with a damp microfiber cloth. I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume this painting was done with acrylics and prime it with acrylic gesso. Although I can't be sure, I didn't test it in any way. But I can at least see that this painting was not varnished. I'm using white acrylic gesso for priming the canvas, and the reason I have the kitchen scale here is I'm gonna weigh how much gesso I used, and then at the end of the video I can calculate how much it costs to reuse an old canvas like this compared to buying a new canvas. I'm using a large flat brush to paint on the gesso with straight vertical strokes to try to make an even layer. I dip the brush in water just a little bit to make the gesso easier to spread, but I want good coverage, so I'm not diluting it too much with water. Remember to cover up the sides as well. I'm gonna tint the white gesso gray with black acrylic paint to make it cover up the old painting with fewer layers, since the darker painting is more difficult to cover up with white. And if you want a certain solid color for for the background, this is a good way to do it. I could have mixed in the black in the first layer, but honestly I wanted white gesso for the thumbnail, so that's why I didn't. If I had mixed in the black in the beginning, I maybe could have gotten away with using just one gesso layer though. The instructions say you can mix in 10% of acrylic paint for tinting, but I saw that afterwards, so maybe I put a little bit more than 10%. And this time I'm doing horizontal lines. Could you cover up the old painting with just acrylic paint and not use gesso? In this case, I think yes. But gesso has better coverage than the acrylic paints I have, so this was faster than just using acrylics. The coverage on the second layer is very good. Unfortunately, I mixed a bit too much paint and I have some left over. The fumes from the acrylic paints can be toxic, so remember to ventilate. After letting the paint dry for a few hours, I sketched on the canvas with a white watercolor pencil, so it shows up on the grey surface. The instructions say the drying time is 24 hours though. I painted with Crelando acrylic paints. It's a set that comes with the 3 primary colors and white and black. I didn't make this a primary color challenge on purpose, but I just didn't reach out to any other paints for some reason. But I messed up. You saw me do some sanding in the beginning, but I didn't do enough. You can still see the hand and wings through my painting. Another thing I messed up was I looked at some photos of sky reflecting to water and noticed the reflection on the water is usually darker than the sky, whereas I made them look the same. So the next day, to fix both of these things, I sanded some of the hand and then painted over the sky reflection in the water. Did it help? Honestly, no. So if there's texture on the painting, do the sanding well in the beginning. If you don't have sandpaper, you could even try scraping off the thick parts with a knife. I'm gonna cover up those areas more later on though, so that it's not as noticeable in the finished painting. So, how much gesso did it take to cover up this 30 by 30 centimeter canvas? By the way, I'll talk in grams, liters and euros, but I'll put the pounds, gallons and dollars on the video so you can see them. This would just get very confusing otherwise. I weighed 26 grams of gesso. I had 4 grams left over, but some of that was the black paint. Let's just say I used 25 grams of gesso. But then I noticed that the gesso bottle says 473 milliliters and nothing about weight. Okay, luckily Amazon and some other online stores do list the weight and it's 450 grams. And the current price I found is 12 euros. I am skeptical about the weight. I've used this gesso on multiple paintings, mostly on cardboard. I've used it on craft projects, on plastic surfaces. I weighed the bottle and it's at 435 grams right now. Then I measured with a stick how much gesso I've used and the bottle seems to be about half full. So the original weight of 450 grams sounds suspicious to me, but I guess we'll just assume that the plastic bottle weighs a lot on its own. So let's talk about the price. I've been asked, isn't it more expensive to buy a 12 euro bottle of gesso than pay a couple of euros for a new canvas? Well, no. When you go grocery shopping, do you look at the price per item or the price per kilogram or liter? If you are deciding between a 1 liter milk that costs 75 cents or a 1.5 liter milk that costs 1 euro and you want the cheaper option, which one is it? Okay, maybe the 1 liter milk is more convenient to use and you'd rather buy that one than the bigger one with the lower price. Or maybe you only need 1 liter, so it makes sense to buy the smaller one. But the principle is the same. 150 grams of gesso costs 12 euros. So the 25 grams to prime this 30 by 30 centimeter canvas costs 67 cents. A new pre-primed canvas of the same size costs 2 euros 50 cents. So you save about 70% by reusing the old canvas. With these measurements, you could prime 18 canvases of this size using the same gesso bottle for 12 euros, whereas the 18 new canvases would cost 45 euros. And these are just the prices I found. There are different sizes and prices of gesso. If you buy a bigger one, it might be cheaper in proportion to the size. And you could find a cheaper canvas too. If you're just planning to make one acrylic painting or you're starting out with painting and not sure whether you'll do more of them, then don't buy a big gesso you might not use. Just buy a new canvas. But why would you want to go through the trouble of priming a used canvas? This method lets you recycle old paintings that don't have any purpose anymore, or paint on other free materials that would go to use otherwise. Or paint on other free materials that would go to waste otherwise. To paint on natural materials or customize different items. Can you paint over a used canvas without priming it? Let's see. I got another free painting from the reuse center that we're going to paint over, half by priming it with gesso and the other half by painting straight over it using acrylics. So we can see the difference once the new painting is finished. It looks like a store-bought pre-primed canvas. I'm guessing the old painting is acrylic and some kind of marker. Let's test if the marker reactivates with water. It doesn't, so we can paint over it. There are multiple parts where the paint is thicker, and we're gonna want to even those out one way or another. This old sandpaper piece is falling apart, but we can just wipe off the dust afterwards. I missed some parts, so I'm going back in with an old knife this time, so you can see that works too. Now let's mark the middle, and I'm just gonna write on the back which side is which. Actually, I want them the other way. I'm going to weigh the same amount of gesso and white acrylic paint to make this somewhat comparable. But since I know it will be hard to cover the old painting completely, let's tint the white gesso a bluish grey and mix a similar color for the other side. The gesso is covering up the old painting pretty well in just one layer. I'm gonna let it dry and save the leftovers in the fridge for any touch-ups. I'm using an opaque white acrylic paint for the paint side, and I did not do this on purpose, but this side turned out a lighter grey. You can see there isn't as much coverage on the paint side. The black marker outlines are still visible. Some of it might be because of the lighter shade, but also the white paint just doesn't have the same coverage as gesso. The second layer was just for touching up the areas that were still showing through. The next difference I can see is that the gesso side is matte and the paint side is shiny. I sketched on the canvas with a watercolor pencil and it doesn't really show up on the paint side. My initial idea was to use one of the dominant colors in the old painting as the base color to make it easier to cover up, and then use that as a contrasting background color for the new acrylic painting. So, since the old painting was mostly blue and green, I planned to make a mainly red and yellow landscape, sunset landscape. But I didn't exactly end up sticking to that plan, as you'll see from how the color scheme progressed. But I don't mind painting on a more neutral background color like grey. When I've done priming versus not priming videos before, I've usually given the finished paintings away as presents. But this time I'm going to keep the painting so I can update you if there's any longer term difference between the two sides. So while I'm finishing up the painting, can you cover up the old painting with paint instead of gesso? If you're okay with this ghost showing through, you can. No, really. I think I say the same thing in every video, but it depends on the old painting. This one was painted with probably acrylics on a pre-primed canvas, and it didn't seem to be varnished, so I don't see any problem with painting straight over this old painting with acrylics. It might just require more paint layers to cover up the old painting, as you saw, than if you were to use gesso and you want a clean slate with nothing showing through. But if it was varnished or the old painting was done in oils, it gets trickier. A varnished painting I would prime first. And oil painting is more complicated than that. I want to paint over this used canvas from the reuse center, but I'm not sure which medium it was painted with. It looks shinier than acrylic paint, so it could be varnished or it might be an oil painting. And if it's oil and I paint over it with acrylics, the paint might crack. So I'm gonna play it safe and paint on the backside. Stay tuned till the end to see what I painted and if the old painting will show through. Let's take off the 50-cent price sticker and unstretch the canvas by removing the staples. I put a towel under the canvas to protect it. The staples were in there pretty tight and the staple remover did nothing, so I resorted to a flat screwdriver to pry the staples off a little bit and then pliers to pull them out completely. This definitely damaged both the canvas and the wooden frame. I also noticed the corners of the canvas were glued. Once I got all the staples removed, I took the canvas off and turned it around. You're gonna need a staple gun for the next part. This might be the first time I've ever used one, or at least it's been a very long time, so I had to find instructions for how to use it. But you just put the staples in and you start from the center of one side, press the staple gun to the wooden frame and staple it. I'm avoiding putting staples exactly where the old ones were, since the canvas was frayed in those parts. Next, I'm pulling the canvas tight and stapling the center of the opposite side. And I'm going back and forth between these two sides, adding staples a few centimeters apart. Then I folded the corners and stapled them. And move on to the two other sides. The staples didn't go in all the way, so I used a hammer to tap them in. So the canvas turned out pretty loose, and what I think I did wrong is you should try pulling it tight with pliers or tweezers while stapling, so it would be tighter. I tried redoing it, pulled out all the staples and did it again. The staples came out a lot easier this time. Redoing the staples by pulling with the pliers helped a little, but not that much, so there's probably something else I was doing wrong too. I did manage to get my hand caught in the handle of the staple gun and it left a mark on my hand for a while. Now clearly this backside of the canvas is not pre-primed, so we need to do that. I mixed pink acrylic paint with white gesso to create a light pink background at the same time while priming the canvas. I have the gesso and other supplies linked below. The first layer didn't cover up the whole canvas that well, but the second layer fixed it. I let it dry for a few hours in between. Priming also fixed the looseness. The canvas is much firmer now, so if yours is loose after stapling it too, don't panic, it might be fine after priming. I sketched out this pattern and transferred it on the canvas and painted over the graphite with matte medium to seal it in and prevent it from smudging the paints. I decided to keep with the theme of the old painting and paint a pattern of leaves. But not Monstera Deliciosa like the old one, I did ginkgo leaves instead. I have sketched them before, but this was my first time painting them. I'm making a collection of paintings with similar color schemes that I can hang on my bedroom wall as a gallery wall, so I'm trying to add pink and light blue into shading or highlights of this painting. Now, was it absolutely necessary to go through all this trouble to paint over this canvas? No, I don't think so. But I get comments on my first canvas reuse video about how about if I don't have this or this tool to remove the thick paint from the old painting? How about if it's this or this kind of painting, can I still paint over it? Well, this method is going to answer some of those questions. It's just another option. For the final test, does the old painting show through? If the light is coming from the front, then no, you can't see the old painting from the backside. But if you light the canvas from the back, you can still see the ghost of the old painting. But if you're running out of canvases, what else could you paint on? And do you have to prime or prep it in any way before painting? What's this next?